Welcome back to the Young Man Squad Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I'm once again your host, Noah Rubin, and this is going to be the third installment of a 4-episode series with Matt Lawson, where we are going through a Dynasty startup mock draft. And then, of course, Matt will continue to be back after that, and we will be talking about the draft. But for now, we're just going to continue with picks 49 through 72. We've already gone through almost 50 picks. We've gone through 48 picks of a Dynasty startup mock and what we would do for those picks. I think the results so far have been really interesting and have created good conversations on Twitter as well. And I'm hoping that we'll do 24 more picks that are able to do that as well, so we can keep those conversations going. So we always love to talk about Dynasty fantasy basketball. But before we get into it, I just want to remind you guys that BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for all your sports betting action. With baseball season in full swing, we're also deep into the NBA and NHL finals, and BetOnline has more ways to stay in on the action with the latest odds, news, and scores, and even live in-game betting while the games are being played. Tomorrow will be game one of the NBA finals. The lines haven't really changed on BetOnline. The Thunder are still favored by 9.5 for game one and are heavy favorites in the series. So if you're interested in getting in on the action either way, BetOnline is a great place to do that. We also keep the dog days of summer rolling with the largest selection of odds on everything, with updated odds on the MLB, UFC, and boxing to tennis and NFL futures. BetOnline remains the best online source for all your sports wagering info. And then in between the games, you can head over to the BetOnline casino with all the top Vegas-style games, including poker and a live casino. BetOnline, the game starts here. All right, and we have Matt back here now. We have the board back up on the screen for those watching. I won't click start just yet, but here in just a minute. Matt, did you have any overall thoughts after kind of looking at the top 48 picks from this board and also having some conversations with people on Twitter?
I think the top 48 here is representative of kind of where the premium dynasty picks are coming off of the board in a dynasty startup. And you really see a crossroads that happens from this point forward, which I think makes this next set of picks so interesting for when you're in a dynasty startup, especially a 12-team or smaller startup. Because before this, for that top 48, for the most part, what you're taking are players who are already productive and are in their primes or are just entering their primes, but they're already really productive players. Maybe you think they're going to get even better if they're on the younger side. And if they're already in their prime, you know what you're going to get. But these are your cornerstone players. These are the guys that you're going to build your team around. Now we're getting to a crossroads where you're having to decide between some players who are a little bit outside of their prime, but still super productive, guys that you think can become top 50 players, or kind of just more the stable, boring top 75-ish assets who are in the middle of their prime, but maybe there isn't a ton of upside. And that causes you to have to make a decision about what you want to do with your roster. And I know I said at the top of this series, oh, don't worry about building your team to be perfect straight out of the startup draft. Just try to get value. The one caveat that I will give to you, and this is from years of doing this and years of running dozens of leagues, the one thing that is difficult to be able to do on the trade market compared to startup value, when you're comparing that to trade value, is players who are past their prime. And if you get some of these older players into their mid 30s, late 30s, it is really difficult to be able to get fair trade value relative to what you paid for them in a startup on the trade market. And the reason for that is pretty simple. There are only so many teams who are going to be contending who are going to want a player who's 36, 37 years old on their roster. And then it's difficult for those teams to have something that is going to intrigue you in a trade, because either they have players who they need now to be able to win that season who are older or already in their prime, and they're unwilling to give them up. And they're less likely to be able to have draft picks that are going to entice you, less likely to have young players that they don't need for their contention run. So it's just hard to make a trade fit with those players. And often I see that if you take some of these older players, you end up kind of being stuck with them. You kind of have to draft and hold because you're just not going to be satisfied with the value that you're going to get on the trade market. So that's a consideration to make here. There could be great short-term return for some older players who could give you top 20 fantasy production from a per game perspective, but you might be stuck with them for the rest of their remaining NBA careers, which might not be the worst thing in the world, but it's something you need to consider when you're making these picks.
Yeah, there's definitely a number of players that should, I mean, they may or may not go pretty quickly here, but should go in this next range of picks that are arguably top 10, top 15 guys in redraft leagues. But you mentioned they're older than 35 or they have some sort of injury history that kind of changes their value, just lowers their value really. And we see in real life as well, some of these players end up being pretty hard for teams to trade, and it requires sometimes picks pretty far out for those trades to even happen, which you don't really see in too many leagues. Maybe if you're playing one with close friends that are going to be playing together for a while, but you're not really seeing 20, 30 draft picks being traded. But you sometimes see that in the NBA for some of these trades to happen. But we'll see where some of these guys go and how quickly. I'm going to go ahead and resume the draft and hopefully turn off the sounds because that's going to get annoying for me. All right. So there's a number of players that we mentioned here on the board. I'm not going to go with one of those super old players quite yet, but I am going to go with a player who probably saw his value decrease a little bit coming off a pretty major injury that caused him to miss a good bit of last season. Another major injury, not as major, that caused him to miss time early in the season. So he didn't play too much in his first season with his new team. And when he did, he still wasn't very good. But I'm betting on what he had done previously and what his role should be next season over what we saw in the limited sample size this past season. That's DeJounte Murray, who probably has had his best seasons of fantasy basketball. They're probably in the past at this point, but I still think that he can contribute top 50 value for a number of years ahead of him. He's no longer sharing the ball, sharing the court with Trae Young. He is the point guard in New Orleans. There are other players that are decent playmakers that will need the ball as well. So may not be quite as ball dominant as he was in San Antonio when he was like a top 10 player in fantasy basketball, but I'm expecting him to have a bounce back year, and he's still young enough that I think that he'll be able to produce at a high level for a number of years ahead.
Yeah, I don't expect DeJounte Murray to play, or at least play a meaningful role in this upcoming season. I don't think it makes sense coming off of an Achilles tear for him to be doing that. But I will say that I do think that he can be productive on the other side of this injury. He's a player that I'd have a tier lower just because of that lost season and the fact that I think it's difficult to be able to see a team kind of running the offense through him at the level that we've seen earlier in his career, but certainly a very productive fantasy stat set. All right. For me, there was one player who was on the board who I grappled with my last couple of picks. I think that the final portion of the season, the last few months, was really impressive from him. And I'm going to make that selection here in Josh Giddey. Giddey is someone who has been up and down dynasty draft boards. He's only 22 years old. At a certain point in his career in Oklahoma City, it felt like he was going to be a long-term top 25 dynasty asset. Great fantasy stat set, really productive from a very young age. But as the Thunder got better, Giddey's role with the Thunder diminished. This year, we saw him struggle to get on and stay on the court in Chicago during the competitive portion of the season when defenses are a little bit more difficult and when the pace of play it's a little harder to play the high volume of transition play the way that the Bulls did down the stretch. But we saw after the Zach LaVine trade and even before it, Giddey really accelerated back into what we saw from him in Oklahoma City with the ball back in his hands. I think he's going to get a substantial contract extension with the Bulls this season that's going to cement him into a large on-ball role and larger minutes. And I like some of the improvement that we saw from him from a catch-and-shoot three-point perspective that should make him a more stable dynasty asset going forward, even if the defensive deficiencies are still there.
For sure. I think this is kind of where you have, to me, I balance the reality versus the fantasy situation because, and what will happen versus what I think should happen. Now, I'm not super high on Josh Giddey as a player. I don't think that he'll probably be worth the contract that he ends up getting, but I do think that it's a realistic scenario that he gets a massive extension from Chicago, maybe in that 4-year, $120 million range. And I think that that's probably more than I would be willing to pay him if I were a GM. However, if he gets that money and he gets that role and he gets that opportunity, it may not lead to championships in Chicago, but I think it could lead to fantasy championships for sure because he's going to be in a high volume role. And we've seen what he can do when he has the ball in his hands. I'm going to go into getting to some of these older players now and draft a player that I don't expect to play like 5 more seasons, probably less than that, but has been very good the last couple of years and has also played a lot of games. He's played over 70 games each of the last 2 seasons. Again, he is an older player, but he's super productive when he's on the floor, and that's James Harden. He's a guy that a lot of issues have been there with his playoff performances, and he's not a phenomenal playoff performer. Kind of shrinks in those moments. but fantasy basketball is played during the regular season, and he tends to play well during the fantasy basketball playoffs. So maybe that's his goal all along, is to help us dynasty managers out. But I'm going to go ahead and take James Harden here, and I feel pretty good about him being really available and productive in the stats that we know he'll be productive in, while also having to deal with probably some turnover and field goal percentage issues.
Yeah. I didn't think that we were going to be in the conversation with James Harden potentially being a player that you consider at the turn of 12-team redraft leagues coming into this next season. But I think that's realistic based on what we saw in this past season. He continues to be super productive. We saw it with and without Kawhi Leonard this year. And I think he remains a player who probably has multiple years left of top 20 fantasy production, at least one. I think we're going to get at least one more of those this year. All right. Definitely some other older players to consider here. And I'm going to take one that, like DeJounte Murray, is going to be missing some time in this upcoming season. I'm going to take Kyrie Irving, who continues to be able to put up top 20 fantasy production whenever he's on the court. He is going to likely be out through most of the season, might miss into the fantasy playoffs. So if you're taking him, you're not expecting to be able to get production this season that's going to help you. It could happen. He's going to be a year removed from the injury once we get around that point post All-Star break, and it's possible that he could come back maybe in a more limited capacity, give you something, but you're really looking from the 26-27 season and beyond. And he is a little bit younger than some of the other aging stars that we're talking about here. Only 33 years old, going to be entering his age 34 season when we're coming into the 26-27 season, when I think he'll be a year and a half removed from the injury and fully recovered. That means with his skill set, one of the most skilled players in the NBA, one of the best handles, one of the best finishers at the rim for a guard in NBA history. I think Kyrie Irving is going to be really impactful through his mid-30s into his late 30s. Think similar to Chris Paul, where he continued to be able to produce productive fantasy years, even into this year, around age 40. So Kyrie Irving would be my selection here.
Yeah, I'd be definitely comfortable taking Kyrie at this position. The current reports are that he could be ready by January to make his debut, but that would be in a very limited capacity. They're not going to throw him back out there and play 40 minutes per game like he did post Luka Doncic trade this past season, because that's partially what led to an injury. So they're going to ease him along. They have a number of other talented players there, but like you said, beyond the 2026-2027 season and beyond, and even into the fantasy playoffs next year, there's a chance that he's back to playing his typical role. He may not be quite as productive as he was, just because he didn't have a full offseason. He was recovering in the offseason, recovering during the regular season, but still a tremendous player and still incredibly impactful in fantasy basketball. So definitely comfortable taking him in this range. I'm going to keep the trend going with some of these older players, with another older guard here that's also played at least 70 games each of the last two seasons. And there could potentially be 2 to 3 more seasons of Steph Curry before he retires. That's a realistic scenario, I think. But 2 to 3 seasons of top 25 at least value, I think that's incredibly valuable here in this range. And there's a number of players who may play a lot longer because they're a lot younger, that never reach the peaks that Steph Curry will probably still reach each of the next 2 seasons. Hopefully he's able to continue with this trend of playing 70 plus games, but even if he's closer to the 65 range, that's still significantly better than some of the other players that I think would be going with the next few picks. So I'm very comfortable taking Steph Curry here in this range.
Yeah, Steph is showing that graceful decline that we see from all-time greats. And I think that it's a pretty safe bet that he's at least going to be giving you kind of second-round value in 12-team leagues when he's on the court, if not better, in this upcoming season. That holds a ton of value. Short-term value matters in dynasty leagues, especially where you build your team to be able to support some of those older assets. All right. I'm going to move away from the older players for a moment, because there's a player that I had well above consensus coming into this past season, because I thought he was going to have a huge role in his team's offense because of James Harden, who we just talked about, and that's Ivica Zubac, who I think went under radars coming into this season because he had always been a player who had lagged in minutes enough that it kind of dampened his fantasy value. But if you saw what worked for the Clippers with James Harden the prior season, it was that pick and roll combination with Ivica Zubac. You also saw kind of an evolution of his defensive game, making him one of the best defensive centers in the NBA, which he was this season for the Clippers. I think at 28 years old, you are now looking at a player who is going to have an extended prime as an elite defensive center in the NBA, also has improved his offensive game. I love everything about Ivica Zubac, and I'm willing to make him a foundational piece of my dynasty roster because I know exactly what I'm going going to get from him from a fantasy perspective. That kind of prototypical big man stat set with elite field goal percentage, rebounds, solid blocks. I think that Zubac's growth as a scorer as well this year was also a big part of why I have so much confidence in him going forward. When a lot of centers can jump and down in value and rankings, Zubac is someone who I think is going to hold a consistent value for many years to come.
Yeah, I really like Zubac. I was pretty high on him over the last few seasons, just kind of silently begging Tyronn Lue to play him more because he always seemed to want to put him in some sort of minute split. And then even when there wasn't another true backup center on this roster, he still wasn't giving Zubac typical starter minutes. This was the first time in his career that he played a significant role. I think his previous career high for minutes was like 28 per game. He got over 30 this year, and we saw him immediately have the best season of his career. Now, he did make genuine improvements as well, but I think the increase in role led to the increase in production as well. And now it's like Tyronn Lue's seen, oh, that's how good this guy is. Okay, so I feel pretty good about his role staying that high as well and him continuing to be productive for the next few seasons at least. And I do think he's a player that we could be looking at 4 to 5 more seasons of similar production to what he just had. Probably best case scenario there. Let's see. There's a few players I could go here. I'm going to go with another player. Maybe not another player because I don't think we've drafted somebody like this today, but a player with a little bit of an injury history who there are a lot of question marks and very legitimate questions about how available he will be, and that's Zion Williamson. I'm a little bit optimistic based on the way he finished this past season and the fact that they sent him to the draft lottery. And that's such a small thing, but it shows kind of a recommitment to say, hey, we want you to be the franchise player. We are committed to that. So I think Zion, I know he missed the last month of last season, but I think if they were a more competitive team, he probably would have been able to play more. I'm hoping for another healthy season this next season from Zion that can be kind of the trend. There are definitely downsides to his injury history and question marks, but I'm willing to bet on the talent here. He did just have a season where he played 70 games during the 2023-2024 season, so we've seen it happen. I'm hoping that it can happen again over the next few seasons.
Yeah, with Zion, I think right now there's so many questions. There was a little bit of optimism, him appearing at the draft lottery, and then we already went back into offseason Zion, where he's being sued in a lawsuit for some pretty horrific allegations in this past week. Now, obviously, there's a difference between a civil lawsuit and a criminal charges. This is only a civil lawsuit, and there's some questions about that civil lawsuit. But there's always something with Zion, and it makes you wonder about how long NBA teams, unless the production continues to be at the level it is when he's available, how long will they be willing to deal with the headache? Really difficult player to be able to value, but certainly an extremely talented one. All right. I'm going to go with another center here who I think holds similar value to Ivica Zubac, a little bit younger. I don't think as talented as a defensive player, but a very good one. I'm going to take Walker Kessler, who I think cemented himself this season as a long-term starting NBA center. There was some question after his second season about whether Kessler was going to be able to be an effective enough offensive player to be able to be a long-term starting center. I think he answered some of that this season, but obviously defensively, his impact was significant this year, an improvement on his second season, kind of what we thought the trajectory was going to be in the first. And I think Kessler, whether it's in Utah or somewhere else, now has an extended prime as a starting NBA center, playing big minutes. Another thing that he did this year, showing the ability to be able to take on that minute load and be a positive impact defensively. I really like Kessler, and I think that he's a good investment at this stage of your dynasty startup.
Yeah, and I do like Kessler as a talent. I think 2 years ago, we were probably drafting him much earlier than he's going here, just with the way we were valuing him after his rookie season. So definitely like taking him here. He's an incredibly talented center. And I think the number one question mark is how much is Utah going to play him? How much are they going to try and win? They just hired Danny Ainge's son, Austin Ainge, and in his press conference, he mentioned that we're not going to see these manipulated lineups to try and improve their lottery odds. Like, okay, we'll see if that ends up holding true in February and March and April. But as of right now, maybe we'll actually see the Utah Jazz try and win games next year, which would be encouraging for Kessler's value in the immediate future, but also long-term if they're just kind of flipping the switch, because it's been kind of a limited capacity the last few years. I'm going to go back and take just one last older player that kind of fits in the same range with some of these other guys we've drafted, such as Steph, Harden, Kyrie. And I guess there might be one or two others, but the number one guy would be Kevin Durant, who's still producing top 10 fantasy value. You hope that he can be healthy. He played 62 games this past season, 75 games the year before that. So hopefully that's kind of the trend moving forward. Regardless if he gets traded somewhere else, nobody's trading for Kevin Durant to have him take a backseat. They're trading for Kevin Durant to have him be Kevin Durant. And that's at least 2 to 3 seasons of high-level production. So I'm very comfortable taking him here.
Yeah, I think Durant, regardless of where he is going to still have a number of years left in his NBA career where he's super productive. This is a guy who I think will try to play as late into his career as possible, into his 40s, loves to play basketball, obviously, and can fit in any scenario, can scale his game to any scenario. A superstar who you could actually see being able to adjust to being a role player in the very late stages of his career and still be super effective at doing that. So I love him here. All right. We all missed a little bit on Scoot Henderson. We all thought that he was going to be kind of that top 25-ish, top 30-ish dynasty asset, the next, a perennial all-star kind of guard. And I think what we need to be able to understand here is that just because a player might not hit those lofty goals, because I think honestly the biggest part of the miss was that the athleticism, we thought it was at a level that it isn't actually at. He's an athletic guard. He's not a hyper athletic guard. His ability to be able to finish is limited by his size because he isn't like prime Russell Westbrook, a prime Derrick Rose. Those comps were off. And they are for most players. But Scoot Henderson has shown dramatic improvement as a shooter. We saw the three-point percentage come up this past season to a level that makes it, along with his free throw percentage, shows a growth in shooting that is going to make him viable as a guard, especially with his assist rate. I think that once he gets cemented into a larger role in Portland, which what I would anticipate happening this season based on some movement that they're likely to have on their roster, we are going to see that leap forward in Scoot Henderson that we've been waiting for. There was a significant step forward in a lot of areas of his ability to be able to impact winning this season. And I think we're going to take the next step from here. A guy who's going to be a long-term starter in the NBA. And I think we'll have some all-star seasons in his career.
Yeah, the talent's definitely still there. We haven't seen the production that we were hoping to see during his first 2 seasons, but we've been talking about this since before he was drafted. It takes time for point guards to learn how to play in the NBA. On top of that, Portland hasn't, I guess, committed to saying, you are our starting point guard, work through your mistakes. He's been in a 6-man role a good bit as well. And there's been a lot of, not issues, but that same kind of thing with Jeremy Grant, DeAndre Ayton, and Anthony Simons being there that's kind of limited some of these younger guys from just stepping into a starting role and just focusing on the future, focusing on their development. Hopefully we see that next season. I'm not convinced that it'll happen, but my fingers are still crossed because I do still like the talent that is Scoot Henderson, and I think he will have a chance to just make dramatic improvements next season, even if, like you mentioned, he isn't what we thought he would be, and he definitely just hasn't been anywhere near what we thought he would be. I'm going to take a center here that is very young and has been, I would say, coming off like a really strong season, played 78 games. One of the best rebounders in the NBA, is going to shoot a high field goal percentage. The free throws aren't terrible for a big. That's Jalen Duren. Decent passer for a big. We saw him get over a block per game this past season. Was better defensively. I'm still not super convinced that he is just this elite or anywhere near elite presence in the paint as a defender, but he showed improvement. And I think now I feel more comfortable as him being a long-term center option in Detroit. And if he's on the floor, he's going to dominate the glass. So I think taking Jalen Duren at this range is something I'm comfortable doing.
Yeah, I think with Duren, you're really telling off season. He's extension eligible. If the Pistons are going to invest in him, if you see that happen early on when he's able to sign an extension, I think that will give you a lot of confidence going forward with him as a dynasty asset. If not, I think there are some real questions here. There was improvement defensively, but the team was far better defensively with Isaiah Stewart on the court. Offensively, I really like Duren's growth and his ability to be able to be a passing hub and to be able to even fit on the floor at times in that next series with Asar Thompson, finding Thompson off of the short roll and passes to the dunker spot. Some really nice highlights there that showed some growth between the two of them, which is one of the big question marks for the Pistons going forward. I'm going to go take another young center. This one I have no questions about defensively. I think that this is an opportunity to buy Derek Lively of the Dallas Mavericks because of what is going on in the Dallas roster. Bringing in Anthony Davis, the chaos created by that, the fact that Daniel Gafford is currently still on this roster, that Cooper Flagg is now coming in. The question that some people who roster Derek Lively in Dynasty leagues might have is, where does Derek Lively fit into this? Finishes the season injured. Is he a big part of their plans? Absolutely. And you need to just go back one season and look at Derek Lively being able to contribute to a team that went to the NBA Finals. His ability to be able to be a switchable defender, also be able to protect the rim, also to be able to contribute offensively. And he's only scratching the surface offensively, but we saw flashes of that in his rookie season. I believe that not only can Derek Lively fit alongside of Anthony Davis and Cooper Flagg, I think that lineup will thrive defensively, will be a big part of what Dallas does in this upcoming season. But long term, he is going to be one of the building blocks that fits next to Cooper Flagg. This is a player to invest in now. Go acquire Derek Lively because it is only up from here.
Yeah, I definitely think he slots in as the starting center, which means that he's probably going to have that job for a really long time. And yes, you took away Luka Doncic, the generational playmaker that was feeding him lobs, but now you're bringing in another really strong playmaker, and you lucked out and you got Cooper Flagg. So that's another guy that can make things easier for Derek Lively as he continues to grow on offense, but the defense is definitely going to be there 100%. Still super young. Totally fine taking him there. I'm going to keep the trend going with another young center who I also don't really have too many questions about defensively coming off his rookie season. That's Donovan Clingan. Would love to see Portland again, but we just talked about Scoot Henderson. Really commit to saying, hey, these are our young players that are going to be the future of this franchise. Let's give them all the minutes. Let's get the DeAndre Ayton out of here. Let's trade him and let's start Donovan Clingan, because I think if we get Clingan in that role where he's probably not playing 33 minutes per game, but like a 28-minute per game role or 26-minute per game role in even any minute split at center with someone else, but he's seeing more of the minutes, we can see him dominate the glass with the blocks. He's going to shoot a high percentage. He's a good passer for a player of his size. I really like Clingan as a talent. I just really, really need Portland to commit to making him the unquestioned starting center and giving him more minutes, because we saw it in spurts during his rookie season. But because of Ayton, because of Robert Williams, we didn't get to really see exactly how good he could be consistently.
Yeah, the defensive impact with Clingan was there immediately, which is why he was drafted as high as he was in the NBA draft. The question going forward is the offensive portion of it was rough. His hands, not very strong, not a great finisher at the rim. And, his ability to be able to score didn't really translate from UConn the way that you would have wanted to see in his first season. So that's what the homework is for the second season. That's what we want to see. If the offensive game makes a leap forward, if he finds a role and is able to improve in some of those areas, then I think we could see a player who could really vault up in dynasty value, even beyond where we're taking him here. That's what we want to see in the second season. All right. I'm going to come back here with a player that I think is also primed for a big breakout in this upcoming season. That's Tari Eason. The time is coming for Tari Eason. We've seen the impact on the court. We saw him and Asar Thompson in the early portion of the season coming out and absolutely wrecking other teams coming off of the bench, creating chaos, being disruptive, defensive playmaking. And that Ime Udoka would love to be able to get more Tari Eason on the court. The problem, of course, is that you also have Dylan Brooks involved in the equation. You also have to find as many minutes as you can for him and Thompson. So where does it come from? Well, this is eventually going to be Dylan Brooks moving out of the picture here. That's going to be a big part of it for Tari. Tari also, we're looking at an extension coming for him for his second contract. So that's going to be very telling as well. He could be part of any mega trade that we see from Houston this year, but regardless, whether he's in Houston or somewhere else, Tari Eason's best years, his prime, are going to be producing top 50 fantasy seasons. The fantasy stat set is there for that. And you should be looking to invest in Tari Eason now before that role is cemented, before that opportunity is apparent to everyone, because when it does come, the fantasy production is coming with it.
Yeah, as you said, Tari Eason, I was dragging him up my queue already because I was going to potentially take him with my next pick. So I love taking him here. He is just made in a lab for category fantasy basketball, I think. You mentioned the kind of the lineup issues that we've seen through his first few years, but really just like the last year or two, specifically with Dylan Brooks being there, where it's like they have so much talent. Now they have to try and figure out, Udoka has to figure out how everything fits together. We could see them make some sort of consolidation trade this offseason, which could be more minutes for Eason, whether it's in Houston or whether he is attached as part of that trade to bring in maybe like a superstar. Not sure exactly what that type of trade would look like, but there could be a move that's made that increases Eason's role. every time he gets more minutes, we're just going to see more defensive stats, more rebounds, more threes, more points. Good things for fantasy basketball. So love taking Easton here. Let's see. There's a number of guards I've been kind of looking at here. I think I'm going to go with Jalen Suggs, who is a really good defensive guard, has had improvements on the offensive end. I guess kind of stepped into more of a spacing role as opposed to what we probably thought he was going to be coming out of Gonzaga. But when you have Franz Wagner and Paolo Banchero, you don't necessarily get the ball in your hands the entire game. Had some injury issues late this past season that kept him on the sidelines for a little while. But he still has plenty of upside on offense, and the defense is where he's really going to make his money. I think he'll be healthy start of next season, still super young. Hopefully he doesn't have any injury issues moving forward. But I think he's pretty much secured in that starting guard role in Orlando, regardless of what other moves they make. I don't think that Suggs would be moved. Now, there is the rumors that I will just quickly mention of some sort of Suggs or Darius Garland swap, and if that happens, he'll probably do something similar in Cleveland to what he's been able to do in Orlando with another ball handler in Donovan Mitchell that is going to, I guess, spend a lot of time on the ball that would put Suggs more in an off-ball role.
Yeah, I think last year we saw Jalen Suggs, because of injuries, have to step into a role where only 7% of his shots were assisted, which was a dramatic change from what we saw in the prior season where he did play more of an off-ball role. And I think that is the right role for him. But we also saw leaps forward, 88% from the free throw line. If that can continue on in this upcoming season, that could be super impactful. Super productive. You saw a big increase in his block rate as well. We already knew that he was going to be one of the top steal producers. And to be able to see him make a leap as well in blocks, really encouraging to be able to see that we could kind of have a perfect storm of his fantasy value come together this season in a more off-ball role with that defensive playmaking and the production at the free throw line. All right, I'm going to take a player here who is similar, I think, to Jalen Suggs. That's VJ Edgecombe. As a prospect, I think that a lot of the knock on VJ Edgecombe is that people want him to be more of an on-ball creator. They want him to be the guy who can evolve into Victor Oladipo. I don't think that's necessarily where this is headed with VJ Edgecombe, but I think like Jalen Suggs, he can instead be a really helpful secondary creator who makes a lot of his impact being a chaos agent, a disruptive defensive playmaker like he was at Baylor with that steal rate and block rate like Jalen Suggs showed last season with an ability to be able to hit catch and shoot threes. I think VJ Edgecombe can fit in on any NBA roster. Super impressive athlete. I love him as a prospect this season, a guy that I think is probably going to be my number 3 rookie prospect when it all comes down to it. We'll see where he lands, but I'm taking VJ Edgecombe here.
Yeah, I think Edgecombe's a really talented player on both sides of the ball. It will be interesting to see where he ends up because it could be 2 very, very different situations that he steps into, but it also would depend on whether or not the 76ers trade that pick, because if he gets drafted to Philadelphia, now he's in a win-now role where he probably doesn't have the ball in his hands a ton. In Charlotte, it might be a little bit of a different situation. Maybe he gets more opportunities with the ball in his hands, even though there is a few talented players there that also need the ball. Or if it's someone else that trades up to 3 just to take VJ Edgecombe with Philadelphia, we have no idea exactly what his role is going to look like, but I do think that he projects as a player that's going to be able to make an impact, specifically in category fantasy leagues. But we'll see how much else he's able to do. I'm going to take another guard here that is kind of not stuck in a situation, but in a situation where he's on a rebuilding team and going to be going through a rebuild for probably at least a couple more seasons unless they trade him. And that's Jordan Poole, who has still been very, very productive in Washington. Now, there are questions of, how many minutes is he going to get? We saw some games, especially late last season, where they were like, yeah, we're going to play Jordan Poole 11 minutes. Then you're done. And it's like, okay, like that kind of stinks for fantasy, especially when it comes to the fantasy playoffs. But I don't think that Washington is going to be going through a 6-year rebuild. I think the way that they're drafting, I'm not anticipating, especially in the East, that it would take more than a year or 2 more and for some of these guys to develop. So we could see the Wizards starting to play more competitive basketball, seeing Jordan Poole playing a more secure role, or they could trade him. And then he could be on a team that's more ready to win now, where he's playing a ton of minutes and he's so productive. I think he made genuine improvements this past season, even though it kind of went under the radar because his role was a little bit different than it had been in Golden State. But I do think that Jordan Poole is an incredibly talented guard that still has a number of really, really productive years ahead of him.
Yeah, I think the catastrophic first season in Washington masked what we kind of hoped for him to be in Washington this season.
Mhm.
Career high in 3-point shooting, up to 98th percentile 3-point volume, and being able to hit them at a 37.8%. That's going to work anywhere, especially when it's combined with an elite assist rate and an ability to be able to finish at the rim at almost 64% this season. I love Jordan Poole in the short term, and I think long term he can find a fit, whether it's in Washington or somewhere else. We see if this level of efficiency is what we can expect from Jordan Poole, which consistency has always been the issue. If he can string this together for another season, I think he could have a nice prime in the NBA that could extend a number more years as a starter. All right, another guard here who I think this is the opposite. A bad season now. I think the bounce back is coming this year. It's Emmanuel Quickley, who never got started this season. It seemed like every time he was ramping up, there was another injury. Then Toronto is pulling their starters in the fourth quarter so they don't, possibly try to win a game. They were punished rightfully in the lottery for that and did not move up. I think that Quickley is a good basketball player. We saw that in New York with his ability to be able to, despite being kind of having a thin frame, be a solid defensive player. We saw that if he could expand his game a little bit, and he got the opportunity to do that when he was traded to Toronto last season. We saw more of that from a rates perspective, even if the minutes weren't there this past year. I think that Toronto is going to have a much more full-throated attempt to be a competitive team this year, especially if they have better luck with injuries. Quickly should have a big bounce back season. We had top 50 fantasy production stretches from him when he was allowed to play and was able to play. I think we're going to have a season that looks more like that, and I'm investing in Emmanuel Quickley if I'm in a dynasty startup or a returning dynasty roster.
Yeah, and even looking back to that second half of the season before, after he was traded to Toronto, the production was really, really good. And then, of course, it was basically a lost season this past season. So his value definitely increased ahead of this past year. And I think a lot of people were expecting the breakout season. We saw what Tyrese Maxey, his Kentucky teammate, had done. I think that just kind of got associated with each other, where it was like maybe Quickly will have that type of breakout. I'm not expecting that type of breakout because of how good Maxey is, but I think Quickly is going to be very, very good. Should be the starting point guard, pretty much unquestioned. I know there's a couple other players that will have the ball in their hands a good bit, but Quickly can knock down shots without the ball in his hands. So yeah, I think it's a good spot for him to have a bounce back year. And if he is playing at a high level and everyone else is healthy, we could see Toronto make some noise and potentially approach a postseason berth. I'm going to stick with the guard trend and take a player who I think had the best season of his career, who's kind of just slowly gotten better. Was not quite a bust early on in his career, but didn't produce the way that maybe we were expecting him to, kind of trended downhill. And the last 2 years have been much better. And that's Kobe White, who I know Josh Giddey is going to be around, but Kobe White was still able to be very, very productive with him there. Zach LaVine's now officially out of the picture. So it's kind of Kobe White and Josh Giddey running the offense here. We saw Kobe White shoot the ball at a ridiculous rate, and he can still get you some assists as well. I'm very excited. I think Kobe White's one of my favorite players in Chicago right now. I think if you're outside of the fantasy production, because I think Giddey gets a bump there, I would consider Kobe White probably the franchise guy there right now. So I'm very comfortable taking him at this range.
Yeah. If Kobe White is able to play 33 minutes a night like he did this past year, have that shooting volume, that's where the fantasy production is going to come. There's obviously limitations in when it comes to field goal percentage, blocks, steals, and rebounds. It's not going to get you those things. But if he gets enough shots, you can see what he can do in this past season, which is putting up inside of the top 70 in fantasy production per game. Kobe White should have another productive season coming up for Chicago. All right. I have some questions about this player, but offensively, it was an awesome season for Mark Williams. Defensively, an absolute disaster. And this is a question sometimes where we put maybe too much weight on a bad defensive team and say all of it is to blame on the center. And as the context around them improves, suddenly that center isn't put in awful positions where there are blow-bys happening all around them and they're put in an awkward position, where there's actual real defensive rotations happening that don't make them always the last line of defense. Mark Williams needs to improve dramatically defensively to be able to, live up to what we saw in fantasy production this year over a long prime, to be able to continue to do this on a good team, a real team, which the Charlotte Hornets were not for most of the season, if not all of it. But Mark Williams offensively was really good. He would have been great with Luka Doncic if that trade wouldn't have been rescinded. That would have been amazing to be able to watch. Defensively, I think that might have been why the Lakers had some pause about it, on top of maybe some medical questions as well. But Mark Williams can produce for fantasy. The real question now, the homework for this next season is, can he produce defensively and become a long-term starting NBA center? If he can, then he's being taken too late here. He should be taken much higher. If he can't do it, then he might be a guy who falls outside of the top 100 and becomes a backup center before we know it. A lot of volatility, but Mark Williams has a lot of potential.
Yeah, and I think the injury question marks are just massive. I mean, we saw the trade get rescinded, and the number one reason was because of a failed physical. So, and even before that, there was a lot of question marks about Mark Williams' health. And I think with the defensive issues, you have to question, like, how much do you go out there and give it your all when your team is that bad? And the good defender, like Brandon Miller's a good defender, but like he was out. LaMelo Ball's not a good defender, but he was out. So it's like, how much effort do you even put out there? So I think maybe if Mark Williams was with the Lakers, that maybe we would have seen him be a better defensive player. Not guaranteed, but we could have potentially seen that. And then still, from the fantasy purposes, he was able to get over a block per game. I think that the fantasy stat set here is really good. The injury question marks are definitely massive, and a reason why he is going a few spots behind Jalen Duren, who was in the same draft class. Kind of associate the two with each other or lump them in together, but he goes a little bit later because of the injury history. But he's still super talented, so definitely fine with him there. I'm going to go with a guy who did not do much during his rookie season, but we loved him ahead of his rookie season. And I think everyone in the Dynasty community is still super high on Reed Sheppard, and it may take another year or two. I mean, I think the plan is for him to be a larger part of the rotation this next season based on reports that I had read, but it may take a year or two before we see him truly peak or get anywhere near that, because I don't think his peak will be at that age either. But super fantasy-friendly skill set here based on what we saw in college. A lights-out shooter, can get defensive stats, a good playmaker. I'm really excited to see what Reed Sheppard can be in 2 or 3 seasons, and what Houston does this offseason with a potential consolidation trade could open the door for Reed Sheppard to play even more next season. Maybe we see that happen a lot sooner than we think.
Yeah, with Reed Sheppard, I think this is the big dynasty buy low, at least from the 2024 rookie class of this season. I'd be kicking the tires. The hard thing is, anyone who spent a premium pick, almost certainly a top 3 pick, and then in most rookie drafts, is going to be unlikely to give him up without getting something significant. But I think there's opportunity there, and something that you should pursue, because Reed Sheppard's fantasy stat set is really strong. I think we always probably should have known that Emi Udoka was going to be reluctant to play someone who's going to get smaller and going to get targeted defensively straight out of the gate. That's just not someone that Udoka is going to want to put onto the court. But I think Reed is going to be able to be a smart enough defensive player that he can play rotation minutes in this upcoming season and will begin to get a foothold in Houston. All right. I have had this player pretty high in my rankings for a long time, and I'm just a big believer in what he is right now in Oklahoma City and what he can become in the future away from Oklahoma City. That's Isaiah Hartenstein, who is one of the most talented centers in the NBA, has shown that throughout his career, was just not getting the opportunity that he deserved to when it came back to being in Los Angeles. You started to see him get more opportunity in New York when the opportunity arose, and you really just see now that this is a player who can fit in on any NBA team. The questions before this season, I didn't see any issue with him fitting next to Chet Holmgren, and they've put away any doubt when it comes to their fit next to each other. I think they'll continue to be a good fit in this upcoming season, assuming that there aren't big shakeups in Oklahoma City, which I don't think there will be. And after that, I think he's going to have a run as a starting center that's going to boost his fantasy value. So I like him as a guy who can have around top 75 fantasy value in this upcoming season, even with Chet Holmgren being more available in this upcoming season, but also that he can have a future as a starter away from Oklahoma City as that roster gets more and more expensive. That's going to boost his value even more.
Yeah, he's a super talented big. He does a number of different things well that's going to be attractive to a lot of different teams. So whether he continues to remain with OKC, like you said, or is with a different team, like you also mentioned, he's going to find a way to get himself on the floor, play a significant role, and be productive. He's a good passer for a big. He's a good defender. He's productive in fantasy basketball when he plays a significant role. And like you said, if he is with a different team, all of a sudden now he might see like 32 minutes per game or somewhere closer to that. Whereas with OKC, with Chet Holmgren, with everyone else that's so freaking talented on that roster, they don't necessarily need to give him 32 minutes per game. He's more in that like 25-minute per game range, but still a super talented big that holds a ton of value. For our last pick or last picks of this episode, because we'll continue on next episode. This will be the last one for us. I'm going to go with a player who is super talented that is going to be a free agent this upcoming summer, or I guess now, that if he signs elsewhere, that his value is going to skyrocket. Redraft leagues, dynasty leagues, if he resigns and stays in the same role, not just spoiler, it's Naz Reid, who is a super talented player for fantasy basketball, is a great floor spacer. He's not the traditional center that's going to just dominate the glass, but he's a super dynamic player. And if he signs elsewhere and he gets into a starting role, I think that he's going to just skyrocket in terms of his 9 cap value. If he stays in Minnesota, I could eventually see him moving into a starting role there. But I think what would be best for his value is if he ends up moving on, gets a fresh start with a team that's going to play him a lot, but the talent is 100% there.
Yeah, it's always impactful at this time of the season to start considering where players could move on to, how that could impact their dynasty value and fantasy value in the upcoming season. Naz Reid is definitely one of those that's kind of an X factor in this offseason and could be on the move to be able to see his fantasy production jump up in the upcoming season. All right. Zach LaVine is a player who has gone, given us top 50 production year after year, had a little bit of a blip prior to this season, but was much healthier again, kind of got everything back on track. Even though I'm guessing, none of the basketball is going to matter that much that he's playing in Sacramento next year. None of us may watch any of the games that he plays unless you're a Kings fan. It's going to produce fantasy value for you because he always just tends to do that. He can tend to be underrated just because it's so consistent in what he does. And honestly, we're never going to see it in the playoffs. That's not going to happen. There's no reason to worry about seeing Zach LaVine in the playoffs anytime soon in Sacramento either. But for fantasy, we don't care about that because he's going to be producing for you. I like Zach LaVine in the opportunity that he's going to have on a team that doesn't really have that exciting of a future, but it's going to be exciting for your fantasy roster. Give me Zach LaVine to be able to finish out my picks for this set of the series.
Yeah, I think we could probably do a whole series, or maybe not. Maybe it wouldn't be worth the time on like what is going on in Sacramento and like what are they going to do. But like you said, like Zach LaVine is going to play a lot. He's going to shoot the ball and he's going to be productive in fantasy basketball, and that much we can be sure about. And with the way the roster is currently constructed, I think they're going to try and make a run at the playoffs. Are they going to get it? Probably not, just based on how competitive the West is. I think best case scenario is they make it to the play-in tournament again, where they've found a nice home. They're one of the teams that has found a nice home in the play-in tournament pretty consistently. And as long as they're playing competitive basketball, Zach LaVine's going to be on the floor playing a lot and being productive. And that's probably about all we can ask out of him. And he's also a good bit younger than a player like DeMar DeRozan, who's also in a similar situation. Maybe LaVine gets traded. I don't see too many teams being super interested in giving up a ton of value for LaVine at this point. It's such a mess in Sacramento, but like you said, LaVine's going to continue to be productive. That's going to do it for this installment of the Dynasty mock draft series that we've been doing. We'll wrap it up next week before we get into some more of the draft stuff. Matt, with 3 weeks until the start of the NBA draft, do you have any content that we need to be on the lookout for that we can check out from you?
Yeah, over on my Patreon, patreon.com/NBA Dynasty ADP, I'm going to be putting out a update to my Dynasty Rookie Draft Guide, which is something that I do every year. I've already put out the first version prior to the Combine, which covered 180 prospects, giving you a full breadth of kind of what the potential pool of draftees and also undrafted players who could impact your Dynasty League. It looks like what their projections are for fantasy and my preliminary rankings of those prospects. And this is a labor of love for me that I've been doing for a number of years now. And I'm looking forward to be able to continue to bring it to you all. I think it can really deliver results. It has delivered results for a number of years, and I hope you check it out.
Yeah, definitely check that out. Support Matt on his Patreon. Follow him on Twitter at NBA Dynasty ADP if you are not already. But that's going to do it for this episode. We will have Matt back next week, and we will see you guys then.